thinking about lettering and type in England in the 20th century was dominated by two names, that of Edward Johnston, the calligrapher, and his pupil, Eric Gill. Here's a collection of specimens of writing from writing books of the 19th century, showing the style that was taught in schools and known rather contemptuously by later calligraphers as copper plate, because it's the style that was used notoriously for example, the Bank of England bank notes, like this £5 note, one of the later of its kind, but printed entirely in black and white, vulnerable to forging, you might think, but in fact, though it's not very clearly visible here, the thin rag paper used for printing it was protected by wavy lines in the watermark, and that was something that was forbidden by law to copy by other paper makers. But it makes a big contrast with the early work of Edward Johnston, who taught himself the use of the broad pen. This is a piece of his own work, a practice piece, written not very perfectly on vellum, but showing his mastery of this particular medium. We know a lot about it because he wrote in 1906 this handbook for writing with the broad pen. He wrote it at the suggestion of Letterforms, who had founded the Central School of Arts and Crafts. And this is Letterforms' introduction to Johnston's book, reminding us that Roman capitals must have been written with a flat brush, determining the thicks and thins of those letters. In 1909, Johnston made a series of cards in which he showed the exact handling of the broad pen. In fact, though he had used a 10th century English manuscript, a Carolingian hand, 4 of the letters, as you can see, were converted into more familiar ones. The A with its upstrike stroke, and of course the S, which didn't exist in the Carolingian form, that is a Gothic letter. There's the model, the British Library manuscript of about 800, which was his model, and that's what he made of it. In the example from the book of 1906 that I showed you, there was a kind of what he called a straight way of holding the pen to make a half uncial style, which he could handle very well, but became less popular than the obliquely held pen of the Carolingian letter. That and this example here were both sheets that he did for his students. It's a kind of a way of copying pen work, and so he could give out specimen sheets to the students who took his classes. Hectographed, it calls itself here. Here's another teaching sheet in which he emphasizes that all letters, in a way, are developed from pen-drawn letters. And this idea of the use of the broad pen and the angle at which it is held was a theme that went on obsessing him. Here's a sketch for a diagram for a revision of that book, which he never got round to finishing, but done in 1938. This calligraphic example, this cursive, is clearly derived from the Italian chancery hand, and one guesses he must have had examples of the work of Arrighi or some such writer. This shouldn't be taken too seriously. Yes, it is a posed picture, and he's using a broad pen made from a feather. Would he have kept the fluff on the feather? Serious calligraphers tend to remove it, if only to stop it tickling their nose. This is an example of ornament which could be written with the broad pen used for the writing, keeping a sort of congruity in the style of both ornament and letters. A rather unexpected commission came his way through the connection of his family with friends of a certain Frank Pick, who was the director of the London Electric Railways, the Underground, who wanted an alphabet to mark the station names. This is the way they were, and not bad at all. But famously, Johnson advocated the use of a block letter made on geometrical principles, so that O and Q and C and G are all done with the compass. This is his artwork for that alphabet. And here is a lithographic copy, which one imagines was then given out to the artists who were drawing the letters for the enamel signs. The capitals are done with an even weight of stroke, and that doesn't cause problems with capitals. Lowercase is another matter, and here the use of the same width of stroke leads into some quite awkward junctions. Notoriously, the M and N, for example, where the curved stroke meets the upright, produce a kind of heaviness which had to be removed when the design was adapted for setting as type by Echikono. And of course, complicated letters like G give endless problems if they're made with an even stroke. That's the artwork for some of these letters. But there we are. That is the origin of the alphabet which London Transport made into one of the elements of its corporate identity. Johnson's pupil, Eric Gill, was 10 years younger, and he took Johnson's class in calligraphy, in the use of the broad pen. And here's an example of a sketch for a monument, a gravestone, written by Gill, showing how well he managed to pick up the handling of that broad pen. I don't think he would have reproduced the broad pen strokes in cutting this in stone, but there it is. It gives a kind of shape to the wording of the monument. Notice also the delicacy of ornament. Gill's later work in stone tended to be pretty austere, but here's a reminder that in the first years of his work, working in stone, he designed some extraordinarily pretty ornament. Moreover, his handwriting was, to my mind, one of the better examples of the italic hand. This admittedly is a rather formal piece of work written to his daughter in 1930. But in a way, this is the writing that he used for marking his artwork for monuments and everything else he did with the pen. He was apprenticed to an architectural practice and found out that he was interested in lettering. He'd been taught, he said, at an art school in Chichester when he was growing up by someone who was fond of what he called the new art lettering, Art Nouveau. And so here's an example that Gill kept to remind himself what he did before he was taught by Edward Johnston. Here, on the other hand, is something that is rather historic, because it's the first job that he did, having left the practice of the architect and set up on his own as a letter cutter in stone. And this is in Cambridge, showing the style that he had developed. One of the jobs he did in his early years as a freelance was lettering with a pen and a brush for reproduction in printed books. This was done for Kessler, the director of the Inselverlag in Leipzig, and designed for reproduction with a line block, an etched photographic image, and drawn about 2 or 3 times the size of the finished job. Gill hated, he said later, the scratchiness of drawing for reproduction photographically, and he took up wood engraving to get away from that. Here's an example of Gill's lettering cut on wood, and a collaboration with the engraver Aristide Mayol, who did illustration for Kessler's Kranachpresse. And here's another piece of collaboration. The figure is Mayol. The 2 lines at the top are early work by Gill, cutting directly into the wood. And the N here is a pen drawing for a letter N that would be cut in wood. I can't tell you who Christie was, probably a fellow apprentice in the architectural partnership, but here is Gill drawing a brass plate, or white metal plate it's called here, to be engraved for the partnership in 1907. And it's of interest to us because of the letter R in Christie, with that straight line to it, which comes straight out of Edward Johnston's book. In fact, the style of R that Gill adopted can be seen in Italian work, which in fact is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. This letter, which one would say was pure Gill, is in fact from the Italian inscription of 1440. Here's a job that Gill did in that year 1907 of the Gill and Christie plate, and he's already begun to move, or perhaps for the first time, I think, into adopting this Italian style. the round E and the curly G are both echoes of the inscription we've just seen. But above all, of course, it is the R with the slightly curved tail that was one that he adopted for the rest of his life. That's from the 1907 inscription. And there is the model for it, or so I think. And so for the rest of his life as a stonecutter, this is the style of R that became a mark of his work. The First War brought commissions for Gill as a stonecutter, which must have been very helpful in earning his living. Here is one of the most prestigious jobs he did. It's to the memory of Raymond Asquith, the son of the Prime Minister, Asquith, Herbert Henry Asquith, and it's in the cathedral in Amiens in northern France. There's a detail showing the delicacy of his cutting, and in many ways some of these early jobs that he did by himself are frankly far more interesting than the rather stereotyped letterforms that were adopted by the various apprentices he had to take on, given the sheer volume of his work. There's the lower part of that inscription in Amiens. Notice the very last word of the inscription, with its fatal reminder how easy it is to leave out just one letter. That last word is conjux, wife, and the N has gone missing from the word. Another of his prestigious jobs was this war memorial for the British Museum. It's on the south front, on one of the pilasters under the portico. And it's worth noticing that in all his work, particularly for this kind of monument, he very quickly learned very, very elegant figures. And it's a feature that is often the weakness of other such memorials. Gill mastered them completely. His work as architectural apprentice shows, as I noted in some of these sketches for memorials, this would be for a client, showing the delicacy of the ornamental work he would have added to an inscription. And it's worth noticing that he's very accurate and good in specifying the stonework, as well he might be, given that training. Douglas Cleverden was a bookseller and a publisher too, who commissioned some of Gill's work as a wood engraver. And this fascia for his bookshop in Bristol is famously the model for the type that he would make for the Monotype Corporation. Monotype were not enthusiastic about the commission, and for a while they only made it in capital letters, rather grudgingly adding a lowercase a bit later on. So here is the specimen of Gill Sands of 1928. And there's the artwork for it. Notice that although he's introduced a curve to the tail of the R, he's taken Edward Johnson's high centre to the M. Did you get that from a Florentine monument? I think so. It's not a classical Roman letter by any means. But in the lowercase, he very sensibly varied the stroke thickness by a factor of about 1 to 3. And this accounts, I think, for the elegance of the Gill Sans typeface. As you see in this preliminary sketch, he was rather uncertain how to handle the letter A. And he was even persuaded on the model of one of the German sans serifs, like Futura, to produce alternative versions of A and G. So there is the Gill Sans alphabet. I have to say this is the digital version. It shows in this particular case his reluctance to let go of his idea that the figure 0 should be a perfect circle. Monotype conformed to convention and made a kind of squashed oval form to fit onto the standard width for the type body for figures. Gill had been fascinated by railway locomotives when he was growing up in Brighton. He admits this, and one of the realizations of his dream was to do a name board for the Flying Scotsman. He even got a ride on it too, which he wrote about. And a job that must have been quite useful for the family budget was a commission to adapt Gill Sans for one of the railway companies, in this case the London North Eastern Railway, set up in the 1920s and used for the station names. There's a curiosity done for the LNER. It's a pretty concept, putting B, P, R and S all on the same grid. But of course it's nonsense. That S, to be visually convincing, needs to go a bit above and a bit below the line of the other letters. But here's an analysis of the lowercase g of Gill Sans, and he even did a artwork for a neon sign using the Gill Sans structure. I find Gill's early work warmer than the, as I said, the rather arid version that he taught to apprentices. And here's a nice example from about 1920. And the same handling of Roman lettering can be seen in this sketch for the layout of a memorial to be cut in stone. He made a Roman type for monotype, and it's curiously linked with some lettering he did for a member of the Mennel family. Whether it was intended for real type, I don't know. For monotype, he made a type called Perpetua. This, which is almost the same date, was made by the Westminster Press into initial letters by making relief line blocks photographically. It never got made as a metal type. That's a pity, I think, because I find the lowercase letters, frankly, more warmer and more interesting than the job that Monotype made of Perpetua. And there is a detail of the ABC of that alphabet. Notice that the B is curiously compressed, and I think it works rather well. Gill's last and in some way most attractive type, to my mind, is one that he did entirely for himself. Here's a design for a letter with, it has no bracketed serifs. As you see, they're quite squarish. It was named Joanna after the name of one of his daughters, and it was made for him by Caslon. The Caslon foundry was still in business in 1930, and these are the drawings to enable Gill's own design to be cut mechanically in a Benton punch cutter. To my mind, they catch the delicacy of Gill's drawing extraordinarily well. Here is Gill's drawing for the italic form. Notice once again the serifs are entirely blocks. But of course, when they're set in about 12 point, as it is here, you don't really see it. In a way, the ink fills in the junction between the serif and the upright stroke. And notice too that, of course, it's a remarkably narrow italic, echoing that letter of 1930 that we saw earlier. It was used in the 1930s by the little printing office that he set up with his son-in-law René Hague. And here is his essay on typography, set by hand, and initially printed by him in a special edition. But this is the commercial edition of 1936, but using Gill's original version of Joanna. It's historically interesting in a number of ways. Unjustified setting, which was a theme that had become used by modernist typographers, but here it is, unjustified lines. And notice too that the ampersand is used in order to keep the line from being overrun with AND. So there you are. That is the original Gill version made by Caslon for Joanna. It was indeed cut as a design for hot metal setting by Monotype, but one has to say that this was a very late example, late 1930s, when Monotype were very rapidly losing the direction of their main type director, Pierpont. It's best, I think, to finish with this note from a letter that Gill wrote to the artist William Rothenstein as a comment on the central place of letter design and letter cutting in his own work.